Not every secret is dangerous simply because it is hidden. Some secrets become far more frightening when people believe they already understand them, when in reality they are only repeating stories passed down for centuries without ever stopping to ask, is this truly consistent with the truth Allah revealed? The Book of Enoch is one such example. It is often called the Forbidden Book, a text excluded from the canon, a narrative shadowed by rumors of fallen angels, giants, and forbidden unions. But in Islam, the real danger has never been whether that book exists or not. The real danger lies in how people misunderstand it, and then build beliefs from that misunderstanding, beliefs that distort their understanding of angels, of human beings, and of sin itself. Pause for a moment and think. If an ancient text had absolutely no connection to Allah's revelation, why does the name Idris, a prophet mentioned in the Qur'an, appear in those traditions? And if Idris was granted pages of revelation of his own, do we have the right to reject every remaining trace simply because it is no longer a source of law for today? Islam does not allow that kind of extremism. But at the same time, Islam also does not allow a naive attitude that throws the door wide open to every mystical story and then calls it sacred truth. It is precisely on this fragile boundary that many people slip. They either erase everything out of fear of being wrong, or they rush into sensational narratives because they satisfy curiosity. The result is that instead of moving closer to truth, they drift farther away, carrying distorted ideas about angels, about falling, and about the nature of humanity. The idea that angels can rebel, be driven by lust, and unite with human beings may sound dramatic, but it directly contradicts the foundations of Islamic Aqidah. When the foundation is laid incorrectly, the entire structure built upon it begins to tilt. What is most frightening is not that people retell ancient stories, but that they forget the standard by which those stories must be judged. The Qur'an and Sunnah did not come to impoverish the human intellect, but to give it a compass. Without that compass, texts like the Book of Enoch can easily shift from material that must be examined cautiously into a doorway to countless dangerous speculations. People begin to believe that evil comes from angels, that chaos is the fault of pure beings, and that human beings are helpless victims in a supernatural drama. But that is not Islam's message. Islam puts responsibility back where it belongs, with the human being standing between knowledge and choice. If parts of ancient texts reflect a truth that was once revealed, that truth cannot contradict the Qur'an. And if other parts do contradict it, that is a sign of human interference, additions and embellishments designed to make the story more thrilling, more terrifying, more marketable. Recognizing this does not strip history of its mystery. On the contrary, it helps us approach history with humility and clarity. Welcome to Madan Prophetic History Explained, where we do not chase shocking stories to satisfy curiosity, but dive into the history of the prophets to distinguish between what was revealed and what human beings later distorted. If you are looking for explanations that help you understand religious mysteries more deeply without losing the foundations of faith, you are in the right place. What makes this story special is that it is not only about an ancient book or a prophet in the distant past. It forces us to face a much larger question. When we encounter knowledge labeled secret or forbidden, what attitude will we choose? Will we deny everything out of fear of being wrong? Will we accept everything out of curiosity? Or will we do the hardest thing? Weigh it carefully, compare it, and place it under the light of truth. If you sense that this journey is not for those seeking easy answers, but for those willing to reflect to the very end, subscribe to Prophetic History Explained now. Your support is what drives us to continue uncovering deeper stories. where history, faith, and intellect meet, and where the conclusion of every story carries a lesson for life today. There is a theological error that has quietly seeped into human thought for centuries, so much so that many people today accept it as obvious, even though it directly contradicts the foundations of Islamic belief. That error is the idea of Ma'adam, fallen angels. Once this concept is accepted, an entire chain of interpretation suddenly appears reasonable. Angels can rebel, be ruled by desire, commit sin, and even unite with human beings. But in Islam, if you ask the right question about the nature of angels, that entire structure collapses. Islam teaches that angels were created from nur, pure light. They are not given lust, they do not possess an ego, and they do not have the ability to choose between obedience and rebellion. Their existence is bound to complete submission to Allah's command. Angels do not struggle internally, are not torn between good and evil, and are not tempted by power or pleasure. That is why the concept of falling, which only makes sense for beings with free will, is wrongly applied to a being that does not possess the capacity to choose. This is not a minor storytelling mistake. It is a reversal of the entire theological order. This error becomes even more severe when Iblis is equated with an angel. In Islam, Iblis was never an angel. He belongs to the jinn, a completely different creation, made from fire and granted free will. That freedom allows jinn to choose obedience or rebellion, faith or denial. When Iblis refused Allah's command, this was not the fall of an angel, but the decision of a being held accountable for his own choice. Blurring the line between angels and jinn does not only distort the story of Iblis, it opens the door to dangerous theories about the nature of evil. When angels are portrayed as beings driven by desire, human beings unintentionally push the responsibility for chaos away from themselves. If even pure beings can fall, what can truly be expected of human beings? From here, stories about angels marrying human women and producing chaotic hybrid races begin to appear. They sound mystical and dramatic, but they reflect a very human impulse: to locate the origin of sin in something supernatural, rather than face moral responsibility. Islam rejects that deflection. In the Islamic framework, evil does not originate from angels, nor is it a cosmic accident. It comes from wrong choices made by beings granted free will, jinn and human beings. When this is understood correctly, many details in non-Islamic traditions begin to reveal their inconsistencies. If angels have no lust, then being pulled into physical desire is impossible. If angels cannot disobey, then the idea of a rebellion in heaven becomes a contradiction. Some claim these stories are only symbolic. But the problem arises when symbols are read as literal history and then shape belief, affecting how people understand Allah, justice, and personal accountability. When evil is assigned to angels, humans unconsciously reduce the role of the ego and the responsibility of choice. And in that moment, the core message of the prophets becomes blurred. Islam, by contrast, keeps these boundaries clear. Angels embody obedience. Jinn and human beings embody the test. Because there is a test, their actions carry moral weight. Because they can fail, obedience becomes meaningful. When other traditions speak of fallen angels, Islam reminds us they are describing something that does not fit the nature Allah assigned to His creation. This difference is not merely academic, it directly shapes how human beings see themselves. If angels can sin, then sin becomes almost inevitable. But if angels never sin and only humans and jinn stand before choice, then every human act carries weight. No one can claim they were pushed into error by an unjust cosmic order. Responsibility returns to where it belongs, the heart and the decision of each individual. Here we begin to understand why Islam firmly rejects the idea of fallen angels. Not to deny ancient stories, but to protect a deeper truth. Allah does not generate chaos through pure beings, and He does not shift humanity's moral burden onto the heavens. When angels are placed in their proper position, human beings must face a far more difficult truth. We, with our freedom and our ego, are where the real battle between light and darkness actually takes place. When giants are mentioned in ancient texts, many people reflexively search for supernatural explanations. Hybrid beings, non-human races, forces beyond nature. But that reflex may hide a simpler and more unsettling possibility, that humanity's collective memory of itself has been distorted over time. Not necessarily through deliberate lies, but because collective memory, when not anchored to truth, easily turns history into myth. Islam does not tell the story of giants in a sensational way. It does not invent a mysterious hybrid race to explain the world's chaos. Instead, Islam offers another frame for early human history, one that, if placed correctly, makes many strange details suddenly become remarkably coherent. Authentic sources indicate that Adam was created with a stature far greater than people today. The earliest generations of humanity differed from us not only in height and strength, but also in lifespan, physical capacity, and environment. Over time, those traits diminished gradually across centuries. Idris lived very early in that history. He did not belong to a shrunk-down world like ours, but to an era still close to the beginning. When ancient texts describe tall, powerful humans building works that amaze later generations, they may be recording memories of early human communities, not beings outside the human species. But as these memories passed through generations, they were exaggerated, embellished, and dressed in supernatural language. Modern people often judge the past by the measurements of the present. We look at remnants of ancient civilizations, massive stones, monumental architecture, stories of extraordinary strength. And instead of asking whether people then were different from us, we quickly conclude they must have been helped by non-human entities. This is not new. It is a long-standing tendency of the human mind. When we do not understand, we assign a supernatural origin. But Islam brings us back to a simpler truth. If Adam was created with great stature and the earliest generations were closer to creation, then possessing superior physical ability is not strange. And if Idris lived among those generations, then memories of giants may simply be how later people described humans who no longer resembled them. As time grew more distant, that difference stopped being understood as a natural process and became something almost unbelievable. What is worth reflecting on is how these memories change. A tall human becomes another species. A powerful community becomes a chaotic race. And eventually, human moral responsibility is obscured by stories of external forces. When people believe brutality and disorder came from non-human beings, they unintentionally lessen the role of human choice in producing violence and injustice. Islam does not need the hypothesis of hybrid creatures to explain humanity's corruption. The history of ancient peoples shows clearly that human beings, no matter how strong, can become arrogant, oppressive, and brutal. Those qualities, not imaginary mixed blood, are what caused many communities to be destroyed. When ancient texts speak of giants who bring chaos, they may be referring to humans with great strength but without moral guidance to match it. There is a quiet fear behind the way we tell stories about the past, the fear of admitting that human beings have always had the capacity to become the greatest threat to themselves. It is much easier to blame creatures that do not exist or supernatural forces than to face the truth that power without humility always leads to destruction. Islam forces us to face that truth even when it does not make us feel safe. Seen in that light, the story of giants is no longer a bizarre legend but a mirror reflecting human history. It reminds us that physical difference or strength does not make a community noble. What defines their worth is how they use that strength. And when memory turns early humans into myth, what we truly lose is not the truth about their stature, but the moral lesson bound to their existence. A hidden fear follows many people whenever they hear the phrase forbidden knowledge. That fear is not about knowledge itself, but about the feeling that knowing too much might pull us off the right path. That fear is precisely why the story of Harut and Marut and Idris has been misunderstood for centuries, told as proof that angels can fall rather than understood as one of the strictest and deepest lessons about human responsibility before knowledge Allah allows them to access. In Islam's understanding, Harut and Marut are not rebellious angels, nor symbols of a heavenly revolt. They are angels sent by Allah in a specific historical context, when humanity was sinking into deception through shaitan and jinn via forms of sorcery, enchantment, and manipulation. Instead of leaving people completely blind to those tactics, Allah allowed a portion of knowledge to be exposed, not to grant power but to place humanity before a clear test. Will they use this understanding to protect themselves or to dominate others? What makes this story unique is how Harut and Marut appear. They do not come to tempt and they do not hide consequences. On the contrary, each time they taught, they warned that this knowledge was a trial. That warning is not a formality, it is a clear moral boundary. People may learn, but they may not justify using that knowledge to harm. Here, the difference between knowledge and wisdom becomes visible. People often assume the danger lies in the knowledge itself, but history, ancient and modern, shows the real danger lies in an uncontrolled ego. Knowledge only reveals what is already inside the heart. For the seeker of truth, it becomes a tool of protection and clarity. For the seeker of power, it quickly becomes a weapon. Harut and Marut did not create corruption. They made human choice impossible to deny. There is a powerful implied comparison in Islam's reading of this story. To cure a disease, a doctor must understand how it works in the body. To neutralize a poison, one must know how it is made. Knowledge of sorcery, in this context, is not for practice but for recognition and defense. Yet as many times in history, people did not stop at recognition. They were drawn to the feeling of control, the illusion that understanding equals power, and crossed the boundary they had been warned about. What is worth reflecting on is that Allah did not prevent this test. He could have kept everything hidden so people would never face such a difficult choice. But then the moral value of obedience would fade. Knowledge becomes a test only when humans can misuse it, and only when that misuse is possible does the right choice carry meaning. Harut and Marut, therefore, are not the source of sin. They are a mirror reflecting the nature of those who approach knowledge. In distorted tellings, this story becomes evidence that angels can do wrong. But in Islam's understanding, it exposes something else. Humans often search for external explanations for their own moral decline. When they blame angels, knowledge, or circumstance, they avoid facing the truth that they themselves chose wrongly. And each time that choice is repeated, the gap between knowledge and ethics grows wider. The lesson of Harut and Marut is not outdated. It echoes loudly in the modern world where knowledge spreads faster than ever, but human self-control often fails to keep pace. We know more and understand more, yet we also have more tools to manipulate, harm, and impose our will on others. The question the ancient test raised still stands. When given understanding, will we choose to be protectors or abusers? Harut and Marut remind us that knowledge is never neutral. It always carries responsibility, and that responsibility cannot be transferred to anyone else. Allah does not punish people for learning. He punishes them for choosing how they use what they have learned. And at that point, the human being reveals their true nature, not before angels, but before conscience and before Allah. When the story reaches Idris, the focus shifts away from debates about texts and historical theories and moves to a larger, unavoidable question. What makes a human being raised to a rank that even angels pause to contemplate? Idris does not appear in Islamic tradition as someone chasing power or miracles. He appears as a man who understands who he is, where he stands in Allah's order, and therefore chooses the hardest path: discipline, purification, and full responsibility before Allah. Idris is human, and that matters. He has a body, hunger, fatigue, fear of death, and the ability to be tempted like anyone else. Nothing in his life suggests Allah removed those trials. Rather, precisely because Idris lived with them, his obedience carried value. He was not created to obey naturally like angels. He reached obedience through repeated choice day after day. The story of Idris meeting. Azrael is often told as a strange tale, but if listened to carefully, it is a profound lesson in awareness. Idris does not try to escape death, nor treat it as an abstraction. He wants to face it, to understand its pain, to know the feeling of the moment every human must pass through. Not out of curiosity, but because he knows that only when life's fragility is truly grasped does worship become sincere, no longer mere habit or form. Being shown hell and paradise was not a random favor. Hell is not presented as cheap horror, but as a reality that shakes the heart. Paradise is not described as a low bargain, but as an invitation that intensifies the longing to live uprightly. Idris does not enter these experiences to boast or gain status, but to deepen humility. Everything he sees pulls him further from the world and closer to Allah. The climax is not simply that Idris remains in paradise, but why that happens. Idris does not defeat Azrael with tricks or empty argument. He understands Allah's law and lives in harmony with it. He tastes death, passes the fear of hell, and enters paradise. Within the order Allah set, once a soul has completed those stages, there is no contradiction in that soul remaining in safety. Allah is not persuaded by words, but by the sincerity of the journey. Here Allah clarifies the difference between angels and humans. Angels have no ego to battle, no desires to overcome, no temptations to resist. Their obedience is perfect, but it is not the product of inner struggle. Idris, by contrast, lives in a world full of forces that pull him downward, yet he still chooses upward, and that choice brings him to a makams. Angels do not need and cannot attain in the human way. The deeper message is not that humans are higher than angels in essence, but that humans can reach a special nearness to Allah through trial. When a person leaves even lawful pleasures for Allah, controls the ego when no one is watching, and chooses discipline over indulgence, they step onto a path where every step carries weight. Idris is not elevated because he escapes being human, but because he lives the human condition with the deepest awareness. Idris's story does not remain in the past. It echoes in modern life, where comfort, information, and countless distractions can numb the conscience. Idris reminds us that spiritual elevation does not come from fleeing the world, but from living in it without letting it possess the heart. He shows that work, learning, creativity, and worship are not separate roads. They can merge when the ultimate aim is Allah. When we look back on Idris's entire journey, what remains is not the miraculous detail, but a simple and heavy truth. Human beings are measured by how they face their own ego. Idris triumphed where many surrender, and for that reason his story is not only sacred memory, it is a quiet call to every heart still seeking a path back toward Allah. The lesson of this story is not in mystical details, but in how to apply it to real life. In a world of temptations, pressure, and comparison, people often choose the quickest escape, giving up, justifying themselves, or blaming circumstances. Idris chose the opposite path. He trained discipline when no one demanded it, guarded sincerity when no one watched, and placed Allah at the center of every small decision. Applying that today does not require extreme hardship. It requires clarity, clarity about what we consume, clarity about our motives, and clarity about how we use what Allah has given. Every person stands before a version of the test of Harut and Marut, and the path Idris walked, whether in knowledge, power, wealth, or social influence. The question is not whether we obtain those things, but who we become and when we have them. Idris shows that the greatest victory is not rising above others, but refusing to let the ego rule the heart. If you feel that the stories of the prophets are not only for the past, but are guidance for the present, join the Prophetic History Explained community so we can continue exploring the profound lessons of prophetic history, human tests, knowledge, the ego, and the path of returning closer to Allah. And don't forget to subscribe to support Prophetic History Explained so we can continue producing deeper, more truthful, and more valuable content in future videos.